Another great change is the return of the Palestinians as autonomous players. After the war of 1948, Israel made a series of armistice agreements with the neighboring Arab states. It didn't even talk to the Palestinians. After 1948, the Palestinians had lost their sovereign self-determination, which was taken over by the Arab states. It's the Arabs who fought for them in 1948. It's the Arab states that became the real enemies of Israel. The Palestinians were a non-existent political player after 1948, and therefore the Arab-Israeli conflict. But since the Arab states have walked out of the conflict, it's again now reverted to being the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's no longer the Arab-Israeli conflict, and it's Israel and the Palestinians. And Israel's present-day challenges, as opposed to the past, when Israel was terrified of Arab power, Israel's great challenge today is the fallout of Arab weakness. Our problem is not Arab power, but Arab weakness. Israel is surrounded by states that hardly function, and therefore has to deal with these non-state actors, which are very difficult to defeat. And Israel faces a series of either non-conventional or what strategists call sub-conventional kinds of military threats. The non-conventional is Iran, of course, and the potential of Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon. And here I'll say something. I know that Iran is a point of difference between Israel and India, but we are in a very different situation. I don't think it's a realistic Israeli fear that the Iranians one day will have an atomic bomb and they'll drop it on Tel Aviv. I don't think that's what strategic Israelis think. The problem is somewhere else. That is, if Iran does acquire a nuclear capability, it will be very difficult for Israel to deal conventionally with Hezbollah, Hamas, and company. What will Israel do if Iran gives a nuclear umbrella to Hezbollah and Hamas, who then attack Israel together with hundreds and thousands of rockets? Will Israel, with a nuclear Iran sitting on the sidelines, be able to do to Hamas and Hezbollah what Israel thinks it has to do to maintain itself? And I think this is what makes Israeli military thinkers very concerned about the future. Because people say, what, the Iranians are not crazy, they're not going to drop a bomb on Tel Aviv. Probably not. But in Israel, when you say probably, that's not good enough. And even if you are, 1% off mark, it's for Israel, it's a sad story. And this is where, Israel and India look at the world through very different prism. I think the distance we travel to get to the university today probably crosses Israel a few times. So we've got size problems. And then the subconventional problems with Hezbollah, Hamas, and company. On the Palestinian question, it's not a military issue. The Palestinians are not a serious military threat to Israel. And Hamas, with all their rockets, is a problem for Israel, but it's not an existential threat. For Israel, the existential challenge coming from the Palestinians is demography. The numbers. Not warfare. Can Israel be the nation state of the Jewish people and control millions of Palestinians? It's not doable. So Israelis have to think seriously about the basic ideas of Israel that our founding fathers had. Can we maintain them along with another 50 years of occupation of the Palestinians? And I would argue that that's impossible. Israel has always wanted to be two things. And this is very clearly written into Israel's Declaration of Independence. To be the nation state of the Jewish people and to be a legitimate member of the family of nations. If we occupy a number of Palestinians more or less equal to the number of Jews in Israel, we will neither be a democratic nation state of the Jewish people, nor a legitimate member of the family of nations. And therefore Israel has to decide. And here we can say there are two very different schools of thought in Israel about what it is that we should do about this. There are those who would say, look at the neighborhood. The neighborhood is such that this is not a time for Israel to withdraw from territory. It's too risky. The neighborhood is so unstable. Israel can't possibly withdraw from the West Bank, or it may be taken over by ISIS, or who knows, Iran and its allies. Israel must stay put. But then there are those who would argue quite the reverse. The Arab world is at its weakest point ever. This is the time for Israel to make great decisions. Israel has room for maneuver, the likes of which it never had in the past. So there were some who would argue all the more reason for Israel to take risks of withdrawal rather than maintaining the status quo, which is not doing Israel any good. I would actually say that what Israeli governments have done over the last 50 years is probably the worst decision of all. And that is the decision not to decide. And the decision not to decide is a decision. And it is the worst decision that Israel could possibly make. And the sooner we move away from that, I think the better for Israel. Just one last word about a new phenomenon in the region which Israel has to think about, and that is the situation that has evolved in Syria, on Israel's border with Lebanon and Syria, the situation that has now evolved from the Syrian civil war. What does this do to Israel, and what is it that Israel can do about it? When the civil war began, the Israelis were not quite sure exactly what we wanted to happen there. Do we want Assad to remain in power? He's the devil we know. Assad and his father kept the peace with Israel for 40 years. Would we rather have ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra and all sorts of other Shiite, Sunni radical militias running Syria? So the Israelis were very divided. And it did appear to be that Assad was losing, which the Israelis began to understand was good news for them. Because if Assad lost, that meant the Iranians would lose too. Assad's loss was the strategic loss of Iran, because what had the Syrian civil war become? The Syrian civil war had become this major battleground of the Sunnis versus the Shiites. What was Syria? A Sunni Arab state, as most of its population is? Or is it an Alawi/Shiite state dominated by Iran? An Iranian spokesman about 2 years ago said that for Syria, for Iran, Syria is Stalingrad. No more and no less. Syria is Iran's Stalingrad. They cannot lose. And just imagine if they did. If you look at the map, if the Iranians lose Syria, there is no land connection between them and Hezbollah. Hezbollah will wither away, and Israel will govern its northern border with huge advantage. But quite the reverse is true. If Assad and the Iranians win. And what happened out of nowhere, and much to everybody's surprise, the Russian intervention. And the Russian intervention in the last minute, Assad was on his way out, tipped the scales and allowed Assad to survive, and not only to survive, to come out winning. Why did the Russians do this? Very briefly, I think there are three reasons. One is the desire of the Russians at a great moment of American weakness and retreat to reassert Russian great power projection in the Middle East. This is reminiscent of the Russian arms deal that they did with Egypt in 1955. This is really an amazing Russian coup. The second factor is strategic in the sense that the Russians have bases in Syria. They have naval bases in Syria, and they don't want to lose them to some conglomerate of Sunni terrorists. And the third thing is to defeat Sunni terrorists. The Russians don't like Sunni terrorists either. They've got their own, the Chechens. ISIS, the third most spoken language amongst the fighters in ISIS is Russian. And if you ask Russians, at least as some polls have done, popular opinion in Russia, and what popular opinion polls in Russia are worth, I don't really know. But taking them at face value, suggests that there is very strong Russian support for their involvement in Syria, because they think it is defeating their Sunni Muslim potential threat. We have a rapport with Russia. We talk to the Russians much more than we used to. The Soviet Union used to be a mortal enemy. Russia is not. But do we have a strategic understanding with Russia to prevent Iran and Hezbollah from taking over the area which is adjacent to Israel's northern border right here? If Hezbollah sit along the border with Lebanon and along the border with Syria, together with the Iranians, that for Israel is bad news. Do we have an understanding with the Russians to prevent that from happening? Do the Russians care enough? I honestly don't know. But for Israel, that is a problem that we really have to watch with great concern. But basically, I would say, more than this is a period of great risk for Israel, not that I want to diminish the effect and the weight of the risks, this is also a moment of great opportunity for Israel. And this is where I think the current Israeli government tends not to see the opportunities. They only see the risks. And browbeat the Israeli public with the risks for domestic political reasons, rather than also trying to make most of the opportunities that exist in this new Middle Eastern strategic trajectory. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. The mistake of universalizing the story and committing the same error that we're trying not to do. And second, would be that you spoke about Maududi and his influence in the Middle East. So my question is, we have people like Abdul Ghaffar Khan, who are also from nearly the same place of origin, and he was a Pashtun who belonged to an extremely violent tribe. And why do you think that someone like Abdul Ghaffar Khan's influence has been restricted to Indian politics, and the subcontinent of India hasn't really percolated into the society of Pakistan, Afghanistan, or communities in the Middle East?
Well, I'll take the second question first. I think the story of Maududi is very particular and related maybe to a coincidence. There was a very radicalizing Muslim brother in Egypt by the name of Said Qutb. The Muslim Brethren in 1954 tried to assassinate Abdel Nasser, and Said Qutb found himself in jail from 1954 until the Egyptians hanged him in 1966. Said Qutb spent his 12 years in prison radicalizing and writing, and he got hold of Maududi. And he translated Maududi into Arabic. Had it not been for this coincidence, maybe this wouldn't have happened the way it did. But I think today, the radical world of, and this is also at the height of Pan-Arabism, you must remember. Today, in a radicalized, very Islamic, Islamist Arab world, they don't need any imports from Pakistan or from here. There are loads of Arabs who are the intellectual leaders of these movements. Whereas in the early 1950s, Said Qutb was writing these things in prison when Islamic fundamentalism was very unpopular. And Said Qutb, as a matter of fact, had very little impact until the defeat in 1967. It was only after the defeat in 1967, when Abdel Nasser was exposed as an empty vessel, that people would take the Muslim Brethren seriously. Had Abdel Nasser won the war in 1967, things may have turned out very differently. Arab nationalism would have had its greatest success instead of its greatest failure. And thereafter, it was very easy for people like who followed in the footsteps of Said Qutb to argue that two things: Islam is the solution, and what they took from Maududi was a concept. And the concept that Maududi produced here was the concept of what he called the new Jahiliyyah. Jahiliyyah in Islam is the period before the Prophet. Jahiliyyah is therefore a negative period preceding the advent of the Prophet, and Jahiliyyah means barbarism. Now, what Maududi did was to argue that Jahiliyyah was not a period in history which has ended, but a condition that can exist now. And it did exist in British India, where he said society, by not living according to the Sharia, it's just like Jahili society. So this is the new Jahiliyyah. This is what Said Qutb bought from Maududi and introduced into the radical thought of Arab Muslims. And today that's the argument. People are either Jahili or not, and if they are Jahili, you can wage jihad against them. Even if they're Muslims. You can wage jihad against other Muslims because they're not real Muslims, they're Jahili. That's takfir. Takfir is to declare somebody else a kafir. That is, they're not real Muslims. So you can takfir, you can use takfir. When Sadat, the president of Egypt, was assassinated by the local Islamic Jihad of Egypt, what they said when they killed him, they said, we have killed Pharaoh. Pharaoh, why Pharaoh? Because Pharaoh is from the Jahiliyyah. Pharaoh is pre-Islamic Egypt. And Sadat was taking Egypt back to pre-Islamic Egypt and therefore was fundamentally illegitimate. So I would say you had this coincidental linkage, which is superfluous. It's unnecessary. And if ideas flow in any direction, it's not from here to the Middle East. It's from the Middle East to here. The flow of ideas when it comes to Islam is not coming from here to there, but from there to here. And Maududi is an exception to the rule for, as I say, this coincidental link between him and Said Qutb. So that's, then the other thing you said, what exactly is Islamic politics? Well, first of all, Islamic politics is not a rejection of nationalism, not a rejection of nationalism. Hamas doesn't reject Palestinianism. But Islamic politics rejects secularism, rejects secular nationalism. Hamas wants to Islamize Palestine. Fatah and the PLO, the secular Palestinian nationalists, demoted Islam to a cultural component of Palestinianness, like other nationalist movements did, like the Jews, by the way, the Zionists did with Judaism. That is, you demote Judaism, you don't reject it, but you demote it to as a cultural component of your Jewish nationalism, religion. That is essentially what the nationalists have done. Hamas and company want to reverse the order, to Islamize Egypt, not to abolish Egypt, but to Islamize Egypt, to Islamize Palestine, to Islamize the Arabs, and not to do what Arab nationalism did. The Islamists see Arab nationalism, and quite rightly from their point of view, as the
Donald Trump is also supporting or advising both the parties for an alliance against these common enemies of Iran or Hezbollah or Muslim Brotherhood. So is there any actual scope for such an alliance, and if so, what will be its impact on the current crisis?
Well, if you mean an alliance between Israel and the Sunni Arab states, well, an alliance is a strong word. Although where Israel once was, that is Israel on its own versus the rest in the Middle East, that is no longer true. That era is gone. Israel has allies in the Middle East, and real allies, who think like we do, who have the same enemies as we do, and we collaborate with them on a number of issues. Egypt, for example, number one. Jordan, both countries that formally have peace treaties with Israel. And then less formally, countries like Saudi Arabia or the Gulf states. There is obviously some kind of under-the-table rapport between Israel and these countries. The problem here, I would say, is for Israel to have an above-board relationship with these countries that would turn into what you call an alliance. Israel would have to do something on the Palestinian issue. I don't think countries like Saudi Arabia and others could come out of the closet in their relationship with Israel unless Israel does something on the Palestinian question. Maybe Trump sees a linkage between these, that he and his very talented son-in-law will revolutionize Israeli-Palestinian relations. I somehow have some doubts about that. So perhaps he thinks that once he fixes Palestine, then Israel and the Sunni Arab states will be able to cooperate. But I don't think he's capable of doing that. And generally speaking, I would make a comment about the outside world and Israel. When I spoke about the term Middle East, it suggested the enormous amount of external influence in the Middle East. But that was at the height of the imperialist era. That era has gone. And it is very difficult for external powers, like the United States or the Russians or both of them together, to fix the Middle East as they would like. To get the people in the Middle East to do what the people in the Middle East don't want to do. And I think it rests, at the end of the day, with what Israelis and Palestinians are willing to do, what they are ready to acquiesce in. And I don't think that the Israelis and the Palestinians can make the great historical agreement that will end the conflict for all time. But I think Israel faces a dilemma where it has to make a choice. I would say that Israel must end the occupation, even if it does not bring peace. I would argue that the occupation is the undoing of Israel in very many different ways. Politically and demographically and internationally and culturally and morally, the occupation is the undoing of Israel. And I would say that for Israel's own sake, never mind what it does for the Palestinians, Israel must end the occupation, even unilaterally. This talk about the Palestinians as being this great threat to Israel, etc., are hugely exaggerated. I mean, Israel is the most powerful country in the Middle East. The Palestinians are not a real player. You know, it's like Costa Rica going to war against the United States. I mean, they will lose. It's not a fair competition. And therefore, Israel should take the initiative to change the situation on the ground, even if it doesn't bring peace. Even if it creates a situation where the conflict will continue to simmer, that Israel will remain the nation state of the Jewish people, it will remain a democratic state, and it will be much more of a legitimate member of the family of nations than it is now. So I think for those reasons, Israel ought to end the occupation irrespective of whether this brings peace or not. If it brings peace, all the better, but even if it doesn't.
1970s were the product of American intervention. American intervention did play a role, undoubtedly. British policies in the late 19th and early 20th century did impact local economies, but there's much to do with local politics in Argentina, Brazil, etc. It's too easy and too simple to say, okay, it's just the external factors that influence.
There's a word I would add to that: agency. Give the local people the agency they deserve. Don't treat them as if they're people who have no mind of their own. It's, I think, bad analysis, and it includes a measure of arrogant disrespect, I would say. All the wars and all the peacemaking between Israelis and Arabs were made by the Israelis and the Arabs themselves, including the famous agreement between Israel and Egypt where Jimmy Carter did help at the end, but nothing would have happened if Sadat and Begin of Israel wouldn't have wanted to make the peace they wanted to make. Give the locals the agency they deserve, including the Palestinians. The Palestinians are not guilty, but nor are they innocent.
With Israel, at least the optics of it. We had an Israeli diplomat who was here a few weeks ago, and he said, in actuality, there has been no change. What this government is interested is in showing things, but things really have not changed at all over the last few years. But showing runs a risk. And what do you think would be the risk for India from the fragmented groups that now rule the Middle East to showing its relationship with the Israelis?
I don't think that there is, in the present circumstance, I don't think there's a great risk to India for doing that. I don't think the Sunni Arab states are going to criticize India for doing what India is doing. I think the Sunni, if you ask the Sunni Arab states what their problems are with India, they don't have to do with Israel. I'm sure they're much more worried about what you're doing with Iran than what you're doing with Israel. And I think that if India has to be concerned about what the Arabs will think in the present circumstances, Israel is not the problem of the Arabs anymore. The big problem of the Arabs today is Iran. Now, it may be perceptually wrong, it may be historically wrong, maybe analytically they're off the mark, maybe the Indians are more correct about this, but that doesn't matter. The perception is that Iran is this big threat. And therefore, Israel is much less of an irritant in these kinds of relations. I don't think, I haven't studied it very systematically, but I don't think India has been under any kind of flack over the last few years for increasing the visibility of the relationship with Israel from the Arabs.
But what about from non-state actors? What I mean are terrorist organizations. And there was a time when Indians used to be very proud of proclaiming that not a single terrorist has been Indian-born.
Yeah.
But that has changed. There are people from here going to who have been recruited by Middle Eastern terrorist organizations.
But Israel's not the reason. Al-Qaeda didn't knock down the Twin Towers because of Israel. I would say that the great engine of Sunni Muslim terrorism is the rage and the fury of a civilization in retreat. It's got very little to do with Israel. The Twin Towers were bowled over not because of Israel, but as a representative of this rage and fury. And this is where you get terrorists from London too. The rage and the fury of a civilization in retreat. That, I think, is the story. Whether your relations are better or worse with Israel, I don't think figures very highly in their considerations.
Do you feel that this is one of those big Arab-Israeli conflict overall in the last 100 years, not just talking about now, Palestinian? Has been a rare case of two nationalisms coming out at the same time at the same place, Jewish and Arab.
I think that's very much the story, and I think both exacerbating or feeding on the other side. I think what is Palestinianness? I mean, what makes Palestinians Palestinian? Palestinianness is not an ethnicity any different from Jordanians. But Palestinianness is very real. It's not about ethnicity. It's about historical memory. Palestinianness is about 1948. Now you can say, well, that's because of Israel, and so Palestine is artificial, it's a result of Zionism. That matters not much. I would say it doesn't matter at all. Palestinianness is this outgrowth of the conflict with the Jews. As much as Israeliness, as the way it has formulated itself and the way it understands itself, is also very much a product of the conflict. And things, had the conflict not been so deeply embedded in the reality of Palestine, maybe we really would have had one state and not two states. But the Zionists had to demand an independent state because of the conflict. If the Zionists don't have a state of their own, and there is one state in Palestine, as some people suggest, who's going to protect the Jews? The Swiss? I don't think so.
I spent my academic learning in international relations, and let me just submit that the importance to the great power politics is relevant, particularly in the Middle East case. The Association of Israel Studies is holding this year's annual gathering around Balfour Declaration, an event which is completing 100 years. So I think great power politics has particularly mattered in the Middle East, yet American intervention is over-exaggerated or over-abused and over-graphic. But I think the Americans have really not been that much. I mean, they have played here and there, but more or less it's the British great power politics that fundamentally altered things in a way. And then I'll submit for your comment.
First of all, I don't disagree with you, but you're again going back to the imperial age. And I don't argue about the imperial age. I gave a talk in Israel some years ago, the title of which was Israel's independence because of the British mandate or despite the British mandate? And what was my answer? That it was because of the British mandate. We owe it to the British. I agree. But from 1948 onwards, and as the states of the Middle East have become independent, you cannot continue to ascribe regional developments to imperialist influence. It's out of date. As I say, give the local players the agency that they deserve. I agree with you about the Balfour Declaration. I couldn't agree with you more. But that's the previous era, which is over.
I was actually tempted to comment something about your comment. On behalf of the Jindal Center for Israel Studies and Jindal School of International Affairs, we would like to thank Professor Anand Ryan and all distinguished academic delegates from Tel Aviv University who have made the conference intellectually engaging, and indeed we are grateful for the cross-cultural dialogues. To Professors Ilan Chon and Asher Sasser, two stalwarts of Israel studies, for their generous time and thought-provoking keynote addresses on the two respective days of the conference. Thank you very much. We wish to thank all conference participants from universities, JNU, Indian Society of International Law, and Jindal friends, and our friend from Kolkata who traveled from London just last night. So thank you. Students and faculty members of Jindal School of International Affairs for attending the event and responses to the papers, chairing and being discussant. So thank you, Deep. We thank Pankaj Jha for yesterday. We thank Sylvia for yesterday. Thank you very much. A special thanks to all the student volunteers for their enthusiasm and tireless support towards organizing the conference. There are 4 names and they are worthy of mention. Thank you very much, Shreya. Thank you very much, Gauri. Thank you very much, Subramanian and Aditya Mukherjee. Thank you very much. They did the work for a full week. Once again, a special acknowledgement to our sponsor, Middle East Forum, Tel Aviv University, for partnering with Jindal University to organize this conference. The idea was discussed last year in a short trip when Professor Anand Ryan met Professor Rajkumar in a hotel in Delhi. And I really look forward to what you said yesterday in the inaugural session, that this is the beginning of the annual dialogue series. So all of you who participated, please keep in touch for knowing the dates for the next annual dialogue in 2018.
We just need to decide whether to do it here or in Tel Aviv.
Okay. All thanks to the Embassy of Israel also. I mean, we thank them for the encouragement and the support they have provided on the way. And the last word, I think I was very tempted to thank the role of universities in human life, or the profession of teaching in the human life that have caused all of us to meet. So let's thank this profession, and I hope we will intersect and meet more because we are into this profession. Thank you very much.